Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today. So what we're talking about today is practical backup. And this is really aimed at people who are in a position of leadership within their organization, who are looking for information around the best principles and best ways to make decisions around backup. There, for many people, it's a fairly boring topic, I won't lie, but for myself, I'm incredibly passionate about it. Backup for us is the ball game. If you don't have good backup, then any failure can become a crisis. With proper backup for your organization, every problem is now manageable because the one thing we can't replace, the one thing that we can't buy off the shelf, the one thing we can't repair is data that is lost to the world. So while it might not be the most interesting topic in the world, I do think in the world of IT, it is the most important topic. And I thank you for joining us today to talk about it. So quickly about myself. My name, as was mentioned, was Chris Gillen. There's a fancy shot of me. I was a naval officer for 8 years. I've been running toll support since its founding, as I founded along with my business partner, Matt Poppy, in 2003. The company has been blessed with multiple awards over the year, including torch awards from the BBB. Myself, I've won as top 20 under 40. And as well, my background is as an IT technician before I moved into my current role. So who is Toll Support? As was mentioned at the beginning, we have been around since 2003. We are what I call a full service IT company, meaning that we handle both day-to-day work, project work, procurement, and training. So all of these things can be handled by us, and we really do encourage you to reach out if you have any comments, questions, quibbles, or queries, or anything around IT that we can help you with. All right, now on to the meat and potatoes. Practical guide to backup. So let's talk about the basics of this. So we're going to cover initially the principles of backup. So these are the fundamental rules that will determine how to design it. And these rules have held largely true since the early 80s and continue to hold true to these days. There's lots of things that are out there that people think are backup, and we're going to talk about which one of those are backup and which one, unfortunately, if you rely on as a backup, is going to get yourself into trouble. You know, like many things, there's the right way, the wrong way, and then there's the TSS way. So we're going to talk about why we do things the way we do it. And then we're going to talk about some basics of how you can implement it and how you can test it. So starting with the principles, the first thing to understand, and if you walk away with one lesson from today, it's really these principles that I have up here. The first thing is that cloud storage is not backup. Cloud storage can be used as backup, but cloud storage in and of itself is not backup. We see many people, many clients who, when they move their stuff into the cloud, just assume that backup is being taken care of as part of that, and that's simply not the case. One of the fundamental rules that we use as an industry is what we call 3-2-1, which is we want to have 3 copies of the backup in 2 or more places, one of which is on site. So what that means, or one of which is off site. So what that means is backup isn't backup unless you have multiple copies of the same information in different areas, right? So often we'll see people move information from one area to the other and assume that because it's moved, it's now backed up. And that's simply not the case. It has to have separate copies stored in separate locations that allow you to recovery, and ideally 3 copies in 2 or more locations, of which one of which is offsite. The second thing is the restore test. And that means that if you're not testing whether or not the backup is working, then we don't know if the backup will work when we need it. Blind faith is not something that we think is a particularly good policy. So backup has to be tested. And unfortunately, for many organizations, the first time that they test their backup is when there's a disaster. And that is something to be avoided where possible. You also need to understand what you're backing up. Backup has a lot of nuances to it. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, what do you mean I want backup? What do I want backup? I want backup everything, obviously. That's sort of common sense and self-evident. Well, the problem with that comes from two areas. First and foremost is if we back up everything, backup can get very expensive. Backing up an entire operating system, as well as all of the applications, as well as all the temporary files that maybe are being used or created as part of the day-to-day operations of the computer, means you're going to spend money and energy backing up stuff that fundamentally aren't potentially relevant to the information at hand. So you need to understand what you're backing up. And this breaks down into basically two categories on a broad spectrum. Category one is files and folders. So with files and folders, I think everyone understands that idea. We are backing up very, very specific folders. That type of backup is leaner. It certainly is much more efficient. It will create a lot less activity because files change more slowly than the system as a whole. And it means we can back up less. The downside of that, and this is where you in a position of leadership really do need to think about, your risk assessment, is the time to recover can be much longer if we're coming from just files and folders. I'll give you a very simple example. If we are backing up a server and that server has all your files on it, but as well, it's running your database for your accounting software, maybe it's running your point of sale system or other industry specific applications. And we're just backing up the information, the data. Well, that server fails, we go to do a recovery, and of course we can recover all the files, and that is the most important thing. That without that, we can't go much further forward. But there's still a long process from the time we recover that to get all the applications reinstalled, get all the client computers reconnected up, basically set everything up the way it is before. So while it might be cheaper, the TTR, time to recovery, is much longer. And in the case of a server that can be fairly complicated, it can be sometimes upwards of several weeks to go from the system failing to full recovery, as in it is 100% replicating the experience of what you were having before. And for many businesses, that is a simply unrealistic and untenable experience. They need to be up and going, and they need to be up and going fast, which is why many companies have looked at, and we certainly encourage, to back up a full image of the computer. And that is capturing everything. It is a complete state of that computer at that point in time, which means that if we need to do a recovery at a later date, we're not recovering a piecemeal. We'll recover data, then reinstall applications, then set up the users, then configure everything. We're simply restoring back to the previous state. And when we restore back to the previous state, everything is as it was from the moment prior to the failure. So where possible and where practicable, use system or full image backups. The other thing that you need to be aware of is, especially if you're just backing up files and folders, there's complexities around databases. Basically, if the information is actively being used, it can be very, very difficult to back it up. In the case of Exchange, which is a mail server, or Exchange or databases, which often will be like accounting software, point of sale, customer databases, so on and so forth, if the data is actively being used, it's hard to back it up. And we need very specific tools to back up that information, which run separate but in parallel with your file and folder backup. So it's important to understand that if you're doing just a backup of data, to ensure that the databases that are running on those machines are also getting captured, because we've seen people be surprised by that in the past. But in general, if you follow these rules, you will be able to come up with a plan for your organization that makes sense and make sure there's no surprises or gotchas. So we see a lot of terms thrown around in the world of backup. And the three main ones we see thrown around are backup, disaster recovery, and business continuity. I think everyone understands the concept of backup. That's just simply taking the data from whatever machine you have and moving it somewhere else in a stored and a secured place, following those 3-2-1 rules. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is really that process of restoration. And disaster recovery may include a lot of different services over and above just simply restoring the information. If you've had a building burn down, tragically, I hope that doesn't happen to anyone, then disaster recovery will be not only recovering the data, but recreating the infrastructure, getting people hooked up in maybe a temporary facility until they're ready to move back into the office, or completely changing. We went through essentially a disaster recovery real world test about 2 years ago with COVID, where everybody suddenly moved to work from home. Well, the disaster at that point wasn't lost data. The disaster was COVID, and the recovery was moving people who typically went to an office and worked in that environment to be able to access their information from home. And then the last part, and this is the part that I feel is so strongly that is so important for small and medium business and for organizations, is business continuity. And business continuity is really not an IT thing. It's more a set of policies and procedures designed by the business in conjunction with their IT support to come up with a recovery process. If the building burns down, this is our next steps. If the building floods, this is our next steps. If somebody is hit by a bus, and we no longer have access to that account, these are the steps. How do we keep the business going? So while we play a role in that, we are not the only part of it. But so for many reasons, business continuity falls on the shoulders of IT. But I do encourage every business to have something written down and understood and promulgated, spread out to the audience, to your employees or staff, that says, right, in case of disaster, these are the processes. And again, going back to that concept of disaster recovery, these all play together. And the whole point of a disaster recovery is that it should be following the business continuity plan. But in many cases, unfortunately, that business continuity plan is, shall we see, developed in real time while dealing with whatever the disaster is we're trying to recover from. And where we can avoid that is best for everyone involved. So I alluded to at the beginning that there is a variety of things that often people say to us, oh, I'm backing up. And then when we actually do the investigation, we look and realize they aren't backing up because there's a fundamental misunderstanding. A lot of these services are what we call redundancy. And redundancy means that there is a copy in 2 or more places, but the copies are synced in real time. And though, meaning that if an error is induced on the primary data, that error then just carries into the backup. So there's no point in recovering for it with it. And RAID is a perfect example of that. RAID is where you have 2 or more hard drives, storage devices in a server or a computer, and both of them have the exact same information. So the information on drive 1 is exactly the same as the information on drive 2, and that information is shared back and forth in real time. So any change on drive 1 is instantly copied over to drive 2. The problem is if you get hacked and somebody encrypts your hard drive, that information carries instantly onto the second drive. So while RAID is great as a tool for redundancy, meaning if one of those two drives fails, the other one automatically takes over, it is not backup because it doesn't have that arm's length distance from the live data, from the live information. And without that arm's length distance, any problem will just simply carry on. Same with information that's stored on site in the same physical location or on the same device. Obviously, if the backup is sitting on the same device that is being backed up, if that device fails, if that server, that computer, that network attached storage device, whatever it is, fails, the backup's going to fail with it as well because it's stored in the same, stored on the same device. External hard drives. Very common tool for backing up, can be used, but only if it's being replaced frequently, as in every day somebody switches and puts one hard drive in and takes the other hard drive out. Unfortunately, vast majority of businesses, after it's set up, copying to external hard drive, that protocol falls by the wayside. We're all busy people. We're all busy. It's a busy world we live in. And unfortunately, if things get busy at work, the first thing that gets pushed off the plate is backup. We can do the switch tomorrow or the day after that or the day after that. And suddenly we realize that it's been 2 months since the last time somebody physically removed it. And then if the building burns down, or more likely a burst pipe in the ceiling, flooding the computer room or server room, destroying all stuff. Now the most current information we have is 2 months old and it's functionally useless. So cloning a drive and then having that clone drive there, just storing it in the same physical location, or using data recovery, i.e. the hard drive has been wiped out, but we're able to recover it, which we have the tools to do. Those aren't backup. So again, going back to that 3-2-1 principle, you really want that information stored offsite in a way that is arm's length from the machine, so that any errors are not carried over into the backup set. Without getting into too much technical stuff, there's a concept within backup called incremental backups, which means that we're only backing up what's changed. And what's really useful about that is that, again, if you have your system hacked and your data gets encrypted, it may copy over the encrypted information into your backup, but with good backup, we will have the previous days and the day before that and the day before that. So we can find the moment in time where the hack happened and revert the information to the moment prior to that. All right. So is Office 365 backed up? No, it's not. Full stop. If you think your information is safe because it's in 365, I've got a bridge to sell you. Microsoft has made it abundantly clear in their language, their legalese, in their nomenclature, that they do not provide backup. They provide redundancy. They obviously have a very reliable system and a robust system, but if they lose their data, they made it very clear in the agreements that you've signed with them that they are not responsible or liable for that. And while they may attempt to do recovery, and that is a may, it is best effort. So while we have lots of tools within Office 365 to recover information, to restore things that maybe were accidentally deleted or lost, at the end of the day, if your information gets wiped out from a SharePoint site and you don't have a backup for it, there is nothing we can do to force Microsoft to do that because they simply don't provide backup. So even with 365, even with Google Workspaces, even with all of these other cloud services, it is incumbent on you as leaders in your organizations to verify that these cloud services have robust backup. And not only robust, meeting those 3-2-1 principles, but also meeting all of the applicable law of the country. Which in Canada comes through the PIPEDA Act, which is a fancy way of saying that in Canada, we have a Privacy Act, and that Privacy Act has certain rules and constraints around it. The first main rule about it, and is probably the most difficult part to overcome, is it essentially functionally prohibits us from putting information into the United States for backup, because anything that is can be used to identify a person, whether it's a client or an employee, we simply can't put it over the border. The principles, as mentioned here, are that you have to be accountable, you have to know where it's going, you have to limit the data collection to what is necessary to do your job. You want to only disclose it to people as absolutely is necessary. You are required to protect that data. And then if people functionally want to audit it, they have that right to know where that data is going, how it's being stored, and what information is being shared. That is all in PIPEDA. All right. This, by the way, is on top of the privacy laws that are in certain provinces within Canada, BC being one of them. BC has its own Privacy Act. So all of these laws have to be in compliance with that. And all of these pale in comparison to the privacy laws in the European Union, which has very, very strict rules about storage and transmission of information, especially across borders. So as a rule of thumb, when you're looking at a backup solution, especially the offsite part of that backup solution, you have to make sure it's encrypted, you have to make sure it's secure, and you have to make sure it's in Canada. And if you're not doing those things, there is a reasonable to high probability that that information will not be in compliance with PIPEDA or BC Privacy Act. All right. So with that in mind, how do we back stuff up? Well, for us, we use Datto a lot. If you're a managed service client, we have probably talked to you about it. And you can rest assured that everything that we do meets the criteria that I've set out. Everything follows the 3-2-1 principle. Everything meets the applicable privacy law. All of it allows us to do either data restores or full image restores, depending on what the client has wanted for us. And we can do that in such a way that it is auditable, measurable, and is testable, and is frequently tested. So on our back end for our company, we are constantly doing sweeps, making sure that the backups are correct and that we're able to restore information from it. In general, for a desktop, you can probably get away with just a cloud backup. It's not an official 3-2-1, but you have a full copy of the data on your computer, and then you have a second full copy in a cloud at arm's length. The two that we like to use is Datto Cloud Continuity and Acronis Cloud, again, meeting all of those criteria. For servers, you want a faster time to recovery. And for those times to recovery, we want to measure those not in days or even weeks, but in hours. And to do that, we have physical devices called Altos and Cirrus that we can sit on in the server room that provides both a local backup and simultaneously is backing up to a secure data server offsite. So we have 3 copies, one on the Datto, one on the server, and one in the cloud. We have them in the 2 locations, and it gives us all the testing and audible tools. And as well, for the higher end units, the thing that's particularly cool about it is we can use them as emergency servers, meaning if your server has died and is not coming back, we can use that backup device as a temporary server, or we can flash up a server in the cloud, and then we can run it remotely in the short term as we repair or replace that server that's broken. And then the next one that I really want to mention is what we call SaaS protection. There's a variety of different flavors out there. Typically, we like the one from Barracuda. SaaS standing for software as a service. We're talking about Office 365. We're talking about Google. Again, following all the same principles, but on top of that, we try and put arm's length between companies where possible. So we prefer to store our Microsoft information not on a Microsoft platform. In case Microsoft is hacked or has some sort of cataclysmic issue, unlikely, but not unheard of, that stops us from accessing the data through the Microsoft platform. We want to have a third-party platform where we can restore the information. The other thing, and this is more, again, from a business strategic standpoint, is I don't like to be locked in with any one vendor. While I may choose to use a vendor, I never want to be so married to them that it becomes functionally impossible for us to remove that relationship if, for whatever reason, we determine it's not a healthy relationship for our organization. And a lot of these companies with software as a service fight against that. They try and make their product as sticky as possible, making it very, very difficult to move off. These cloud backups provide a tool that at the end of the day, if we need to now take this data and migrate it to a new platform, we have that capacity to do that, whether it's through SaaS protection or through backup of our cloud servers through Azure, through the Azure server backup. All right. There are plenty of other backups you'll see out there, iDrive, Barracuda. These are all brand names out there. Apple, of course, has their Time Machine, again, very much aimed at the home user. And then Acronis, which we talked about before, which started life as full image backup software and has now created a whole cloud component to that, so that those images can now be stored in the cloud. The main thing is for you to ask and for you to ask your IT department is, does it meet those fundamental principles? Does it meet the 321? Is it in compliance with PIPEDA? Are we keeping the information in Canada? And if I wanted to see that information and do a test on it, how would I go about doing that? So whatever service you're using, make sure it meets those criteria. So here are a couple areas that we get nervous if we see it. So if the backup is unmonitored, from our standpoint, it is almost essentially like having no backup at all. There has to be some way for you to test, and it also has to be some way for it to reach out and tell us that it's broken, right? For our system, we have what are called dead man switches. And what that means is if those backup devices stop reporting in after 30 minutes, we get an alert that says this device is not reporting in. We can start to investigate. Second one is we used to see backup being done a lot with mapped drives, where you'd have a Y drive or a B drive or what have you, that you have all the information backed up on. The problem is, as mentioned before, if your system gets hacked, being able to hack that mapped drive is very, very easy at that point. In fact, most of the ransomware software will just automatically do it. And then the other things we already talked about is if it's untested, or then it's not something that we can trust. So we want to make sure that we can trust it. And last but not least, and this is more from the IT side of the house, is if we suddenly see a spike in new devices on a network, we want to know why. Because new device on network, and from your end as a business leader, if you suddenly see your backup costs spike up because you're suddenly backing up way more data, ask why you're backing up way more data. Is there been some change in your system or processes? Or, is something be happening from IT, or is there something weird going on that you need to let your IT department know about? So sudden changes in price around backup, as in you were backing up 100 gigs before, now you're backing up 1,000 gigs. You want to be on top of that. So if you do have to do a restore, I would hope you would generally get your IT department involved, but if not, before you do it, you want to have a plan. You want to communicate that plan with people. You absolutely want to double check what's being restored, and wherever possible, you don't want to restore back to your original location until you verified that the information restoring is correct. You don't want to copy over good data with bad data. And you also want to be very clear from a version perspective what version you're doing, because you may have to make a decision, again, especially in the case of a ransomware hack, of balancing the risk of going back far enough that's prior to the hack, but understand that there may have been information or work that had been done after the hack that will be lost. So in most cases, I would strongly suggest restoring not only to a separate location, but actually to a separate device, if possible, for testing purposes. Once it's tested, then you can restore it to the end, determine that's correct, then you can restore it to the original location. But if we have to send a hard drive for data recovery, or if we need to do the data recovery, it's much easier to recover from a drive that is just missing information than a drive that is both missing the information and then has been overwritten with bad information. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for attending today. And listening to me ramble on about backup. Again, my name is Chris Gillen. The company is Total Support Solutions. If you have any comments, questions, quibbles, queries, for those of you who were contacted by email, please feel free to reach out by email. For those of you who were contacted via LinkedIn, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. And I'm just going to drop my email address in the chat window here, so that anyone who wishes to reach out to me directly can do so. And we would love to have a conversation about backup or any other IT related issue that you may be experiencing. I'll now open up to any questions.